So before we start our story about building atoms, let me apologize for subjecting you to my goofy voice on a day that I'm not even supposed to be there. But we have a few introductory slides that I really have to kind of present before you get a chance to look at some real videos with a real narrator and then go to a worksheet. And of course, this will be full of mistakes because I'm just ad-libbing the whole thing. So let's start with Democritus, who was a Greek philosopher around 400 BC, who looked nothing like this. This guy is clearly from the Middle Ages and it's from somewhere in Europe. But Democritus lived a happy life, basically spending his father's money and dying blind and broke at the end, but it never dimmed his outlook. And he did a lot of smart things in that life. Among them was to be the first person to really introduce a theory of the atom, how tiny particles make up all the stuff that we know around us. He basically stated that matter consisted of these invisible particles that were separated by what the Greeks called the void, which is just plain old empty space. But all the other Greeks, especially Aristotle down here, hated the idea of the void. But Democritus was bold enough to propose it, and he thought that an atom was the smallest piece of matter that could possibly exist, and it could never be cut any finer. So the word atomon in Greek really means uncuttable. Our modern word atom literally means a particle that can't be cut. So we're actually going to pause here, and you're going to go to the front table, get one of the little pieces of paper and a pair of scissors. Everybody gets to do this. Bring it back to the table, to your table, and then cut the piece of paper in half. Cut that half piece in half, and keep cutting the piece of paper in half until you can't cut any more. I'm going to bet that you can't do more than 7 cuts before it gets too small for the scissors. So go ahead, pause the audio, and do that and come back. Well, that was fun. And you now have this tiny little piece of paper sitting on the end of your finger, and Democritus basically went a couple steps further. He thought about doing that experiment and realized that there's probably a piece of paper, a piece of matter that's so small that you can't cut it any further. And so you'd have to stop there. And that little particle, the atom, would be indestructible. You can't cut it any further. It would be obviously solid, but too small to see. And that these particles would basically be flying around empty space, running into each other. And interestingly, he proposed that the atoms would never stop moving, which was an idea that, again, Aristotle hated, because Aristotle, as we remember from talking about Galileo and Newton, thought that all objects would come to rest eventually. So Democritus was really 2,000 years ahead of his time, and he beat Galileo and Newton to the idea that a particle would have inertia and keep moving unless there was a force applied to it. Furthermore, he thought that all atoms in an element are the same. That sounds pretty familiar. We just went over that when we talked about pure substances. And that atoms differed in size and shape, so they were like little Lego blocks that you could put together to make all the different compounds around us. The last statement was that atoms would have no mass. And that turns out to be the only thing that Democritus claimed that turned out to be quite flatly wrong in the end. But everything else, as we'll see, very close to the modern theory of atoms. So now we'll talk about Dalton.